In a hospital in Vienna, there was a sound the women learned to dread. It was a small bell, carried by a priest, and it rang in the corridor whenever a new mother was dying. In the first clinic of the Vienna General Hospital, that bell rang almost every day. The women lying in those beds had just given birth. Many of them were young, healthy, poor. They had survived the labor, and then, 2 or 3 days later, the fever would come, and the sweating, and the swelling in the belly, and within a week, a great many of them were dead. A young doctor walked those wards and listened to that bell, and he could not understand it. The women in his clinic, the ones staffed by doctors and medical students, were dying at a rate that horrified him. In the clinic right next door, run by midwives, far fewer women died. Same building, same city, same kind of patient. He decided he would find out why, if it cost him everything. It did. He proved how to stop mothers from dying in childbirth, and his own profession destroyed him for it. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. He was born on the 1st of July, 1818, in Buda, in what is now part of Budapest, the son of a grocer. He went to Vienna to study law and somewhere along the way switched to medicine, which was not a glamorous choice. He finished his training, specialized in obstetrics, and in 1846 he took a position as an assistant in the first obstetrical clinic of the Vienna General Hospital, one of the largest hospitals in the world at that time. His job was to examine the pregnant women, to assist at the difficult births, to teach the students, and to keep the records. It was that last duty, the keeping of records, that would change everything, because Semmelweis was the kind of man who actually read the numbers he was writing down. What he read frightened him. The hospital had 2 maternity clinics, and they took patients on alternating days, which meant the 2 clinics drew from the same population of women off the same streets of Vienna. The only real difference between them was who delivered the babies. The first clinic, his clinic, was where the medical students learned. The second clinic was where the midwives trained. And the death rate in his clinic was monstrous compared to the one next door. The disease that was killing them was called childbed fever, or puerperal fever. It struck women in the days right after delivery. It started with chills and a racing pulse. Then came the high fever and the pain, and as it spread through the body, the woman would slip into a kind of poisoning of the blood, and then she would die. Doctors of the era had theories about it by the dozen. They blamed the air. They blamed overcrowding. They blamed the woman's own constitution, her morals, her milk, the cosmic influence of the seasons. None of these explanations could survive the simplest question Semmelweis kept asking, which was this: if it is the bad air, or the season, or the crowding, then why does it spare the clinic next door, where the air is the same air, and the season is the same season, and the rooms are just as full? He went into the records, and he laid the 2 clinics side by side, year by year. The numbers are still there, and they are brutal. Across the years from 1841 to 1846, the first clinic, the one with the doctors and students, lost on average about 1 mother in 10. The second clinic, the midwives, lost fewer than 1 in 25. In the worst year, 1842, the first clinic buried more than 15 out of every 100 women who came in to have their babies. In 1846, the year before everything changed, the doctor's clinic admitted just over 4,000 women, and 459 of them died. 459 mothers, in a single year, in a single ward, of a disease nobody could name the cause of. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The women knew. They were poor, and many of them could not read. But they were not stupid, and word traveled through the city about which clinic was the killing floor. Women admitted on the days the first clinic was taking patients would beg on their knees not to be sent there. They wept. Some of them, when they realized which clinic they were headed for, chose instead to give birth in the street, in a doorway, in the back of a cart, anywhere but in that ward. and then they would carry the newborn in afterward and claim the birth had happened on the way. And Semmelweis noticed something that made no sense at all under any theory he had been taught. The women who delivered in the filthy street, in the cold, with no doctor and no clean sheets and no help, those women survived childbed fever at a far higher rate than the women delivered by trained physicians in a teaching hospital. The dirt of the street was safer than the hands of the doctors. He did not yet know why, but he could not unsee it. So he started testing causes, one after another, the way you would work through a locked door with a ring of keys. He looked at the priest and the bell. In the first clinic, when a woman was dying, the priest would walk the full length of the ward, past every bed, ringing his bell to give the last rites. Semmelweis wondered whether the terror of that, the sight and the sound of death coming down the row toward you, was enough to throw a weakened new mother into a fatal fever. It sounds like superstition now, but he treated it like a hypothesis. He had the priest come in by a side door, in silence, with no bell, so the other women would not see. The death rate did not move. He crossed that off. He looked at the position the women lay in to deliver. The two clinics used slightly different birthing postures, and he wondered if that was it, so he made his clinic match the other. Nothing. He looked at ventilation, at the laundry, at the order in which patients were examined. He kept the variables and changed them one at a time, and the bell kept ringing, and the women kept dying, and he was getting nowhere, and it was eating him alive. He wrote later that the whole thing made him miserable, that everything seemed inexplicable, that the not knowing was unbearable when he had to walk the ward every morning and look at the faces of women he was fairly sure some of them would be dead by the end of the week. Then, in the spring of 1847, the answer arrived in the worst possible way. A man he loved died. His name was Jakub Kolečka, a professor of forensic medicine at the university and a friend and colleague of Semmelweis. Kolečka was doing an autopsy with his students, examining the body of a woman, when one of the students slipped with a scalpel and nicked Kolečka's finger, a small wound, the kind of thing that happens in a dissection room and nobody thinks twice about. But Kolečka fell ill and the illness moved through his body, and he died. And when they performed the autopsy on Kolečka himself, Semmelweis read the report and the floor dropped out from under him. The damage inside Kolečka's body, the inflammation, the poisoning of the blood, the pattern of it, was the same. It was the same thing he had been watching kill the mothers in his ward. A man had died of childbed fever, a man who had never been pregnant, who had simply gotten a corpse's blade into his finger. That was the key turning in the lock. Semmelweis understood, in a single terrible flash of connection, what was happening in his clinic. To see it the way he suddenly saw it, you have to picture the rhythm of a doctor's morning in that hospital. The day did not begin in the maternity ward. It began in the basement, in the dissection room, among the dead. The medical students and the doctors, himself included, began their mornings in the dissection room. The Vienna General Hospital had embraced the new science of pathology, which meant doctors learned by cutting open the dead, and the dead very often included the women who had died of childbed fever the day before. The physicians would open these bodies with their bare hands, study the rotting tissue, and then, without anything more than a rinse in plain water, they would walk upstairs to the maternity ward and reach inside living women to check the progress of their labor. They were carrying death on their fingers from the autopsy table to the birthing bed. Semmelweis called it cadaverous particles. He did not have the word for it, because the word did not exist yet, but what he was describing, decades before anyone could prove it, was infection. And the midwives in the second clinic had a far lower death rate for one simple reason that now seemed blindingly obvious. The midwives did not perform autopsies. They never went near the corpses. Their hands were clean. Think about what that meant for him to realize. It meant the doctors were the cause. It meant he himself, with his own hands, had almost certainly carried the infection that killed his own patients. He wrote about that guilt with a directness that is hard to read even now. He said that only God knew the number of women he had carried prematurely to the grave. He was not looking for a villain out in the world. He had found the villain, and it was the well-meaning, educated, respectable physician, washing up with a splash of water and feeling perfectly clean. So in the middle of May, 1847, he acted. He put a basin at the door of the ward, and he ordered that every doctor and every student scrub their hands, not in plain water, but in a solution of chlorinated lime, which is a harsh chemical disinfectant, before they touched a single patient. He chose it because it was the thing that finally killed the smell of the cadaver on the skin, and he reasoned that if it could destroy the stink of death, it might destroy whatever invisible thing came with it. Doctors hated it. The chlorine cracked their hands and burned. But Semmelweis had the authority in that ward, and he enforced it, and then he went back to his ledgers, and he waited to see what the numbers would do. What the numbers did was a miracle, except it was not a miracle, it was hygiene. In April of 1847, before the hand washing, the death rate in the first clinic had been over 18%, nearly 1 mother in 5. By June, with the basin of chlorinated lime at the door, it had fallen to about 2%. By July, it was down near 1%. The killing floor had become, almost overnight, as safe as the midwives' clinic next door, and then, for a stretch the following year, it did something the first clinic had never done in its history. It went a full month with not a single death from childbed fever, not one. The bell in the corridor fell quiet. He had done it, with a basin and a bottle of disinfectant, and the simple, radical demand that a doctor wash his hands. A 30-year-old assistant had cracked the deadliest secret in the maternity ward. He had not figured out the why all the way down, not the germs themselves. That proof was still years away. But he had figured out the how. He knew what stopped it. He had the bodies, or rather the absence of bodies, to prove it. Any reasonable person, looking at those numbers, would have to conclude that he was right and that the discovery would spread across the world and save uncountable lives. That is not what happened. What happened next is the reason we are telling this story at all, because the tragedy of Ignaz Semmelweis is not that he was wrong. He was right. The tragedy is what the world did to a man who was right. The trouble started with the implication, because his idea was not just a medical theory, it was an accusation. To accept what Semmelweis was saying, a doctor had to accept that he himself had been the instrument of death, that every mother he had lost, he had likely killed with his own unwashed hands by carrying corruption from the dead into the living. For a profession that saw itself as the very picture of the gentleman and the healer, this was unbearable. The physicians of Europe wore their dirty hands almost as a badge of hard work. The idea that a doctor's hand, the hand of an educated gentleman, could be unclean, could be a thing that needed scrubbing in acid like a butcher's block, struck many of them as not just wrong, but insulting. They were offended. And offended men do not weigh evidence. They defend themselves. It did not help that Semmelweis, for all his brilliance, made it easy for them to dismiss him. For years, he refused to publish a proper account of his findings. The numbers were extraordinary, but the man would not sit down and write the book that would have laid out his case with the force it deserved. His ideas spread instead through lectures by his friends and through second-hand summaries, some of which garbled what he actually meant, and that gave his critics an opening to attack a version of his theory he had never quite said. And his own superior was against him. The man who ran the first clinic, Professor Johann Klein, was an older physician of the old school, and he did not like this junior assistant, who was effectively telling the whole staff, the professor included, that they had blood on their hands. When Semmelweis's term as assistant came up, Klein declined to keep him on. He gave the position to another man. Semmelweis, the doctor who had just driven the death rate in that very clinic down to almost nothing, was pushed out of the hospital where he had proven his case. He had saved those wards, and the ward did not want him. He did have powerful friends, Some of the most respected figures in Viennese medicine, men like the great pathologist Karl von Rokitansky and the brilliant diagnostician Joseph Škoda and the dermatologist Ferdinand von Hebra, believed him and tried to champion his work. Hebra wrote about it. Škoda gave a lecture praising it. For a moment, it looked as though the new idea might carry. But the resistance from the broader profession was heavier, and it came from men with enormous reputations. In the great medical centers of Europe, the leading authorities lined up against the hand-washing theory, and when the most famous doctors in the world tell the rest that an idea is nonsense, the rest tend to listen. And here is a fact that makes the rejection even harder to forgive, because it shows the profession had already been warned once and had already refused to listen. 4 years before Semmelweis put his basin at the door in Vienna, on the other side of the Atlantic, an American doctor in Boston named Oliver Wendell Holmes had reached nearly the same conclusion by a different road. In 1843, Holmes published an essay arguing that childbed fever was contagious, that it was carried from patient to patient on the hands and clothes of the very physicians and midwives who attended the births, and that a doctor who had been near a case of the fever had a duty to clean himself thoroughly before going near another mother. He did not have Semmelweis's mountain of clinic statistics, but he had read the case reports, and he had seen the pattern, and he said it plainly. The disease followed the doctor, and the American establishment treated Holmes much the way the Viennese establishment would later treat Semmelweis. 2 of the most prominent obstetricians in the country went after him. One of them, Charles Meigs of Philadelphia, was scornful of the whole idea that a physician could be the carrier. The notion most associated with Meigs, and with the wounded pride of his entire profession, was that a doctor is a gentleman, and a gentleman's hands are clean. That was the wall. Not evidence, not data, but the unshakable conviction that a man of standing could not possibly be the thing spreading death. Holmes was right and was brushed aside, and a few years later, Semmelweis would be right and would be broken. And the through line between them is the same refusal. 2 men, 2 countries, the same truth, the same answer from the people in charge, which was that this cannot be true because it would mean we are the ones to blame. So Semmelweis left Vienna. In 1850 he went back to Hungary, to Pest, wounded and bitter, and eventually took charge of the maternity ward at a small hospital there. And he did the same thing he had done in Vienna. He enforced the hand-washing, and the same thing happened. The death rate among the mothers in his care fell to almost nothing, year after year, while in the great hospitals of Europe, where they ignored him, women kept dying by the thousands of a disease he had already shown them how to prevent. He was watching it happen. He was reading the reports from Vienna and Paris and London, the mortality figures from the famous clinics, and he knew that every one of those deaths was a death that did not have to happen, that the cure existed, that he was holding it, and that the world had decided not to listen, because listening would mean admitting fault. That knowledge did something to him. Imagine carrying it. Imagine knowing, with the certainty of arithmetic, that mothers are dying all over the continent right now, today, of a thing you have already cured, and that the only obstacle is the pride of your colleagues. It would be hard to stay calm. Semmelweis did not stay calm. Finally, in 1861, after 14 years, he wrote his book. It was titled, in German, Die Ätiologie, der Begriff und die Prophylaxis des Kindbettfiebers, which means the etiology, the concept, and the prophylaxis of childbed fever. Into it he poured everything, all the data, all the reasoning, all the proof. It should have been the triumphant statement of his life's work. But by then, the anger had been building in him for too long, and the book is not the cool, devastating presentation of evidence that might have won the day. It is furious, it is repetitive, it argues with his enemies on the page, and when it was reviewed, the reviewers were harsh, and one prominent obstetrician dismissed the whole thing as naive, and that seemed to break something loose in him. He began to write open letters, public ones, addressed by name to the most important obstetricians in Europe, the men whose refusal to wash their hands was, in his eyes, killing women by the hundreds, and he did not mince words. He called them irresponsible. He told them that their teaching was murder, that they had the blood of mothers on them, that history would record them as killers. He signed these letters and sent them out into the world. Whatever sympathy remained for him drained away. A man can be right and still make himself impossible to side with, and Semmelweis, consumed by the rightness of his cause and by the horror of being ignored, was burning every bridge he had left. And here the story turns dark in a way that is genuinely hard to take, because we do not fully know what was happening inside him. Through 1865, his behavior grew stranger. He drank. He grew distant from his wife and family. His moods swung. Historians have argued ever since over what was actually wrong with him. Some believe it was early dementia. Some believe it was the late stages of syphilis affecting his brain. Some believe it was nothing more than a mind broken by years of grief and rage and helpless watching, the exhaustion of a man who had been screaming the truth into a wall for nearly 2 decades while women died. We cannot say for certain, and honest accounts admit that. What we do know is what his colleagues did with it. In the summer of 1865, his friend Ferdinand von Hebra, the same man who had once championed his work, came to him with what sounded like good news. There was a new medical institute, Hebra said, and he wanted Semmelweis to come and see it. On the 30th of July, they made the trip together to Vienna. But it was not a new institute. It was an insane asylum, and the visit was a trap. When Semmelweis understood where he was and what was being done to him, he tried to leave. He was not allowed to leave. Several guards seized him. They beat him. They forced him into a straitjacket and they put him in a darkened cell. He never came out. Somewhere in that struggle, or in the beating, his right hand was wounded, and the wound became infected. And the infection spread through his body and poisoned his blood, exactly the way it had spread through his friend Kolechka all those years before, exactly the way it had spread through the mothers in the first clinic. 2 weeks after they locked him in that cell, on the 13th of August, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis died. He was 47 years old. The autopsy gave the cause of death as pyemia, which is blood poisoning, the very kind of infection he had spent his entire life trying to prevent. The man who taught the world how to keep wounds from killing died of an untreated, dirty wound in an asylum at the hands of men who had decided he was the mad one. Almost no one came to the funeral. The medical society in his own country, the country he had returned to, did not give a memorial address. There was no great mourning. The savior of mothers, as he would much later be called, was buried with barely a notice, and the leading doctors of Europe went right on not washing their hands. Now here is the part the story owes you, the answer to why we remember him at all. He was not wrong. He was years ahead. Within a generation of his lonely death, the world caught up to him, and it caught up because of 2 men who could finally explain the thing Semmelweis had only been able to point at. In France, the chemist Louis Pasteur was proving that disease could be caused by living microscopic organisms, germs, invisible things that traveled from one place to another and multiplied inside the body. This was the germ theory of disease, and it was the missing why under everything Semmelweis had observed. The cadaverous particles he could not name were, in fact, germs, carried on the hands of the doctors from the dead to the living, just as he had said. And in Britain, a surgeon named Joseph Lister read Pasteur's work and put it directly into practice in the operating room. Lister began cleaning wounds and instruments and hands with antiseptic chemicals to kill the germs before they could take hold, and the death rate after his surgeries collapsed. Lister became famous and honored for antiseptic surgery. He was knighted. He was celebrated as one of the great benefactors of mankind. And what he was doing, at its heart, was the same thing a mocked and broken Hungarian doctor had been begging the profession to do 20 years earlier. with a basin of chlorinated lime at the door of a Vienna maternity ward. The proof kept coming. Robert Koch and others would go on to identify the actual organisms, to show the world the bacteria under the microscope, to make germ theory undeniable. And once it was undeniable, the strange tragedy of Semmelweis came into focus. He had been right the whole time. He had been right when they pushed him out of the hospital. He had been right when they reviewed his book with contempt. He had been right when they called him mad and beat him in a cell and let him die of the disease he had conquered. The man was not crazy. The man was correct, and the institution was wrong, and the institution won anyway, for a while. There is a name for what happened to him now. People who study how organizations behave call it the Semmelweis reflex, the reflexive rejection of new evidence because it contradicts what everyone already believes and because it threatens the people in charge. His own life became the textbook case of a truth being killed not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient, because accepting it required powerful people to admit they had been doing harm. That is the real disease in this story, and it did not die with him, and it did not stay in the 1800s. Think about what it actually cost. Between the day Semmelweis proved that hand-washing saved mothers and the day the profession finally accepted it, decades passed. In those decades, in the hospitals that would not listen, women kept dying of childbed fever by the tens of thousands, every one of them a daughter, a wife, a mother of children who would now grow up without her. Every one of those deaths, preventable by a basin and a few cents of disinfectant. That is the price of the Semmelweis reflex, paid not by the doctors who refused to wash, but by the patients who trusted them. So here is where it reaches you. The next time you walk into a hospital, look at the wall. There is almost certainly a dispenser of sanitizer mounted right there by the door, and a sign asking everyone to use it, and somewhere in that building is a policy, written down and enforced, that the staff must clean their hands before they touch you. That policy is not obvious. It is not common sense. It cost a man his career, his reputation, his sanity, and finally, his life to put it there. And it cost the world decades of refusing to believe him. Every clean hand that reaches toward a patient today is a small monument to Ignaz Semmelweis, the doctor who was mocked for telling surgeons to wash their hands and who was buried alone for being right too soon. He proved how to stop mothers from dying, and his profession destroyed him for it, and then it quietly adopted everything he said and forgot to thank him. The lesson is not really about hand washing. It is about how hard it is for any of us to accept that we have been causing harm and how much we will sacrifice, including the messenger, to avoid admitting it. His warning still stands. The truth does not need your permission to be true, and the people most certain they are clean are sometimes the ones carrying the most on their hands. If stories like this one, the forgotten people who paid for the comforts we take for granted, are the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and stay with us.